Cool. Right, I've kind of assumed I've got everyone's name right. Um, I'm rather dyslexic, so if I do spell any of your names wrong, do shout at me. Um,
Looks good though.
is that 37? So this would be 38. Oh, Celine's here. Lovely. She's probably the best person to talk to about this sort of topic.
Yeah.
Where is show meeting? All right. Hi, Celine. You're quite literally the only person attending, so feel free to come on and join in. Oh, you're
Oh, you're on
muted.
mute, Celine.
Hey everyone, thanks. Yeah, my connection is quite unstable, so I hope I'm gonna be able to follow.
That's all right.
Do you want to cancel if I'm the only one? I know about local context. I'm very upset that no one else is joining.
No, we're going to record anyway, but well, okay,
Yeah.
and can talk for herself.
Yeah, we're just going to record it because a lot of it is kind of educational and background material anyway, that I think being on the YouTube, like the BGA channel, will get hits. People will be interested later. So because we prepared it, we may as well do it.
Yep.
Cool. In that case, I will hit record. Oh, we got someone's viewing on YouTube as well already. So there we go. Right, I'm going to hit record now. And there we go. Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 37 of BGA24. Today, this is a session on local context by the local context team. Please take it away.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. I think we're going to start with a round of introductions. Anne, do you mind introducing yourself first?
Yes, of course. Geoditch. Hello, everybody. My name is Anne McCartney, and I'm an assistant researcher at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and an adjunct assistant professor at the University of College Dublin. And I work with the local context team as the co-chair of the technical implementation working group with Ashley Royes. So maybe I'll pass it forward to Ashley.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Rojas. I'm a software and web developer for Local Contexts. So along with Anne, co-chairing the technical implementation working group, I help manage the development of the Local Context Hub, which we'll talk about, along with the API integration, which we'll maybe get into a little bit later. And I'm also calling from Wappinger Homelands, which also known as Connecticut in the United States. So it's lovely to meet you all, and I'll pass it on to Emily.
Great, Shukma. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Santhanam. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Americas with Local Contexts. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation out of Oklahoma, here in what's known as the United States, but I live and work on the lands of the Red Willow people in Taos, New Mexico. So really excited to be giving this presentation, and I'll pass it off to our last team member, Corey Rowe.
Thanks, Emily. So I'm Corey Rowe. I'm the Director of Outreach and Strategy with Local Contexts. I'm a settler based on Wappinger and Paugussett homelands in Connecticut in the United States as well. I've been with Local Contexts for over 3 years, a couple different outreach capacities. My background's in museums, but we're really excited to be sharing with you all today. We are going to have some resources and links that we will share in the chat, but also in the Discord in case you are interested. And I believe myself and Emily are members of the Discord. In case you do have any questions after the fact, watching the recording, we are happy to answer those. So the plan for today, we're going to talk a little bit about background information before we move into the local context labels and notices. We will give a short local context hub demo and talk a little bit more about what that is before ending on implementation and metadata. So we're going to move right into Emily, if you don't mind giving our land acknowledgement.
Sure, yeah. So for those of you who might not know, a land acknowledgement is a statement of respect, which is often given before an event or talk, and typically recognizes the history and enduring relationships of Indigenous peoples to the land where the event is taking place. So local context is based across multiple countries, and this is our organizational land acknowledgement. As an organization that transcends geographic and national boundaries, local context acknowledges that all of the lands and waters that we occupy are Indigenous homelands, and we recognize the ongoing significance of these lands and waters for Indigenous peoples in the past, present, and into the future. Our work is focused on addressing that ongoing legacy of settler colonialism and in supporting a more equitable future. So we do a land acknowledgement to help disrupt settler colonialism and to recognize whose lands we're on, as well as our responsibilities as guests here. And in case you are interested, you can find out more about land acknowledgements at the links that Corey will drop in the chat.
Great, and we'll pass it over to Anne to kick us off.
Yeah, so before jumping into the content of this workshop today on the local context, labels and notices, I did want to just remind us all of the importance of including Indigenous peoples within the biodiversity research that we all do, especially biodiversity genomics, considering we are at the BGA workshops. So Indigenous peoples have been recognized as both effective stewards of biodiversity and for their role in conservation in many highly accredited landmark reports and biodiversity-related treaties, including the latest reports released by the IPBES and the new Global Biodiversity Framework adopted by the Convention of Biological Diversity. These reports and treaties are based on scientific evidence. Scientific reports have shown that a third of intact forest landscapes, meaning those without conservation or conversion or fragmentation, overlap with Indigenous lands. Additionally, over 60% of mammal species have 10% of their ranges on Indigenous lands. And interestingly, around 71% of primate species inhabit Indigenous lands. Finally, in comparison to protected areas, Indigenous lands have less invasive species. Despite these key contributions to both biodiversity and conservation, Indigenous peoples have not always been meaningfully included in biodiversity research, including in biodiversity genomics research.
Yeah, and I'll share a little bit about that next. So just to give a little bit of kind of foundational background information, research methodologies in general really emerged and often remain in a very colonial extractive logic. We don't need to look too deep into the history of the sciences or social sciences to see why this is. So research in the Western sense was used to categorize, evaluate, and dehumanize people, to support colonialism and imperialism, and to dispossess. Research really takes Indigenous knowledges to be made into resources and property that is supporting colonial production of knowledge about Indigenous people. And this very knowledge production is used to produce deficit views of Indigenous people and justify policies that govern Indigenous people's lives. The processes of research have these inherent logics of possession and hierarchy embedded within them. The researcher makes subjects, and these subjects are not entitled to occupy a space of authority. Researchers then and even today conduct research on, not with, by, or for Indigenous communities, which can be a one-way extractive exchange that did or does not benefit those communities. Those researchers are then also considered the authors, owners, and rights holders of that Indigenous data and knowledge. I'll pass over to Anne to continue.
Oh, thank you, Corey. So there are many reasons why the biodiversity research enterprise has caused distrust amongst Indigenous peoples. Throughout colonization, species were commonly extracted from colonized lands and brought back to the lands of those explorers. Many of these specimens became the foundations for commercial products, museum collections, and zoological gardens that we still have today. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see an example of biopiracy, some examples of biopiracy. So biopiracy is defined as bioprospecting that exploits plant and animal species by claiming patents over their general use. So the most left-hand side is the case around Hevea rubber seeds, and it's commonly referred to as the first case of biopiracy. Here, Henry Wickham, a rubber tapper working for the Royal Botanical Gardens in Kew, collected 70,000 perishable Hevea rubber seeds from Brazil, which were then rushed back to England for germination, and the rubber was then sold to British colonies in India, making a lot of money. Another very good example of biopiracy took place in the 1950s with a species known as the periwinkle. Here, the company Eli Lilly began research on a plant, this plant as a source of oral insulin. Specimens were taken from India, Jamaica, and Madagascar, where it is native. They uncovered that this plant had anti-cancerous properties. However, Madagascar did not receive any of the benefits from the drug revenues, which totted up to over $400 million before the expiry of the patent. My next example is Dr. Hans Sloane, which is the top right-hand side of your screen. And Dr. Hans Sloane was a British physician who commonly traveled to Jamaica on collection expeditions. On these expeditions, he commonly collected species of specimens to take back to Britain with him. And he collected them both for kind of curiosity and for medicinal purposes. But during these travels, he often required the labor and knowledge of unpaid enslaved Africans as well as local peoples. He was married to an heiress of a sugar plantation in Jamaica, and the money from that sugar plantation commonly funded more species collection. Throughout his life, Hans amassed over 120,000 plant specimens across 70 countries, most of which were from Jamaica. He bounded the plant specimens into 265 catalogue volumes. Upon his death, he then donated his work to the British Empire. And his catalogues then became the basis for the British National History Museum, and those collections can actually still be found today, which is super interesting. So although this was decades and decades ago, the extraction of plant resources remains a systemic issue today, with around 400 million plants residing in herbaria in the global north that were actually collected in the global south. My last example is about the dark history of many zoological gardens across the globe. In the past, Indigenous peoples were commonly taken from their homelands and placed in zoological gardens as ethnological exhibits. We now commonly know these ethnological exhibits as human zoos. In human zoos, Indigenous peoples were typically forced to wear traditional clothing and carry out traditional practices for the amusement of the zoo's attendees. Importantly, these zoos promoted the scientific narrative that Indigenous peoples were the missing link between human and non-human species. Such was the case with Oda Benga, a native man from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who was transported to the Bronx Zoo for display in the museum's monkey house alongside the orangutans. So with those examples, I'll pass it back to Corey.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, so that's really helpful context for thinking about research. And if we want to think about research and data in a different way, maybe with Indigenous people having control, authority, and sovereignty over their belongings and information, we wanted to pause and also establish what is Indigenous data. So Indigenous data is data, information, and knowledge that impacts Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at the collective and individual levels. So this includes data about Indigenous resources and environment, data about Indigenous individuals, and data about collective nations and people. So using that as our basis, when we're talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, we're talking about Indigenous control of Indigenous data. And so this is Indigenous data for governance and Indigenous governance of data. Both data for governance and governance of data are to support the self-determined well-being of Indigenous people, as well as reinforcing the rights to engage in decision-making with Indigenous values and collective interests. This slide comes from the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which is really at the center of the Indigenous data sovereignty movement. We know this is a lot of information that we are sharing here, and a couple of folks that are here live. If you do have any questions, we'd welcome you to put them in the chat and see if we can clarify anything for you before we dive into more about local contexts. I'll just pause here for 30 seconds just to see if anybody has any questions. Okay, well, we'll continue on. Please feel free to continue to put things in the chat if you do have questions, comments, thoughts. But we'll get into a little bit of background about local context now. So local context started around 2010, and it really started as an intervention to bring Indigenous cultural authority and data sovereignty back into cultural heritage spaces like libraries, archives, and museums. It's since expanded into data repositories, including genomic data repositories. To establish cultural authority and data sovereignty, local context worked in partnership with Indigenous communities to create the traditional knowledge labels, or TK labels. After the TK labels, the notices for institutions and researchers were also developed, and most recently, the biocultural, or BC labels, for biocultural collections and data. We're going to expand more on both the labels and the notices later on. But just to also continue with a little bit of history about local context, local context really started as a research project based out of universities in the US and Aotearoa, New Zealand. But in 2022, we became an independent nonprofit organization registered in the Navajo Nation. And as part of that transition to a nonprofit, we established an Indigenous-led council, which will continue to grow. And we recently brought on our founding executive director, Dr. Stephanie Runninghawk Johnson, to lead the team through this exciting next phase.
So speaking of our team, here is a graphic of our team, which is made up of our council and our staff. Our staff is composed of a tech development and design team, an operations team, and then our outreach team. So as I did mention, we're an international organization. We're based across North America and Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we are mostly connecting remotely through video calls like this, but are occasionally able to connect in person for events, conferences, and training programs. So I'll now pause to give you an idea of the widespread interest and application of the local context labels and notices. So here's a map that shows our global connections of communities, institutions, and researchers who are either interested in or are currently using the local context system. So as you can see, our connections are particularly strong in North America and Oceania, as that is where our team has been based so far. And we have largely been working in English, but are growing to support other languages as well as other geographical areas as our team is able to grow. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the terminology that we're going to use throughout today when referring to community, institution, and researcher. So we'll often use the term community as more of an international way to talk about First Nations, tribes, bands, confederations, land councils, and similar collective sovereign groups. So these groups have ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live, where they occupy, or from where they may have been displaced. In following the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Corey is going to share in the chat, we recognize the sovereign right of Indigenous peoples to self-describe and also to determine qualifications for membership and citizenship. So when we're talking about communities more generally, we're talking about common concerns and experiences across communities, because Indigenous communities are not homogenous. and each community might have different needs and perspectives around permissions, protocols, and access for data and collections. Such communities are represented by entities like tribal historic preservation offices, cultural centers, language departments, land councils and corporations, tribal archives, libraries, museums, and also colleges. Now, we use the term institution to refer to non-Indigenous organizations that are stewarding or collecting Indigenous data or collections. And while there are Indigenous institutions, we will always specify in those cases. Institutions can be a gallery, a library, archive, museum, university, research lab, and more. And their focuses can really range from natural history to fine art and anything in between. Now, lastly, when we talk about researchers, we're referring to individuals who are conducting research or generating data. And the researchers we work with are diverse and span linguists, biodiversity, history, and law. So we do use these categories knowing that there are many individuals who might occupy multiple roles and affiliations. And our organization recognizes the many hats that people wear, especially Indigenous folks who are working in these spaces. So we do strive to be inclusionary of that kind of positionality. So now with that, we're going to review a few of the foundational ideas behind local contexts.
Yeah, so we wanted to talk about some of these kind of foundational ideas that prompted the creation of local contexts with the challenges that Indigenous people see in data and information systems. So we've touched on some of these ideas briefly, but we wanted to summarize some of the main ideas. For more about these ideas, we do recommend our short films, and we'll also share a few additional links in the chat that might be of interest. So first, Indigenous data and collections are held by institutions around the world. So these include museums, libraries, repositories, and more. As previously mentioned, due to the colonial legacy of how these materials were collected, significant information is often missing. So this could be information like community names, and that information could have been excluded, not considered important, or just been wrong. This misinformation and misattribution continues to affect communities' ability to find that information and reassert control. Further, communities are largely not the legal rights holders of their own materials. This is because of the way that intellectual property operates, which is based in 15th century colonial law. So even across countries and states, copyright law is often similar because of this common origin. And this law only allows certain type of authorship to be recognized, one that is based very much on the form of the material, on singular or named authors, and on what is perceived to be original. This means communities often have a lack of control and governance of this material, which is ultimately an issue of sovereignty. So this becomes even more concerning as some Indigenous knowledge about collections are not open or should have restricted access. Add to this, there's more researchers working with Indigenous peoples and data than ever before. This extractive or reductive research paradigm can remain in place. And in this era of big and open data, these mistakes and omissions that exist in the metadata are replicated into the far-reaching digital forms of the material. So with these issues, the Indigenous communities our founders worked with, we're looking for a way to intervene and interrupt these systems. So we'll also just see if there's any questions. We'll continue on into the local context notices and labels, but please feel free to add anything to the chat if you'd like more clarification or just have any thoughts. But I'll continue into just sharing a little bit about the labels and notices. So they are both digital labeling tools. They are markers of Indigenous rights, interests, and cultural authority, and they can be used in a variety of contexts. So we've seen them used in databases, collections catalog, archival records, apps, websites, course syllabus, and more. And we're going to start with our tools for institutions and researchers, which are the notices, and then cover the labels, which are for use by communities. After we introduce each, we're going to share examples of them in use that we hope will be relevant to you.
So as Corey mentioned, the notices are our tools for institutions and researchers. Here at Local Context, we believe that institutions and researchers have an important part to play in this work and that they have a responsibility to disclose Indigenous collections and data. So to help with that, we created our notices, which were developed to create pathways for partnership, collaboration, and support of Indigenous cultural authority.
So the notices were developed when our leadership came to find that institutions and researchers are on their own journeys in this work and can do something to help make visible Indigenous data and collections so that communities can find their knowledge and belongings and be a part of the decision-making around their access and use. So notices can be used on a range of materials. They could be used on a data set, a cultural belonging, across a collection, on a syllabus or website, and much more. The notices can help to disperse some of the labor involved in this work from communities back onto institutions and researchers who will often have greater familiarity with their own data and materials. So we describe the notices in 3 categories. They each function to communicate different interests. So first we have our engagement notice, open to collaborate. This notice is for an institution or researcher to commit to ethical reciprocal engagement with Indigenous communities. This is often where we see institutions and researchers start. Next, we have the disclosure notices. So these are for identifying and sharing where there are Indigenous collections. This is working towards that challenge of supporting communities to find and access their collections and knowledge. And there are 3 disclosure notices: attribution incomplete, biocultural or BC, and traditional knowledge or TK. The third category is the collections care notices, and those were developed within the past year in collaboration with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. These were created very specifically for collections in physical storage that are being stewarded outside of communities to make clear when specialized cultural care is needed. So unlike the other notices, these notices were designed to be printed to physically label those spaces, and they're also used after consultation with communities. We're not going to be sharing examples of the CC notices today. It's really an internal facing tool, and we would not really expect most of the collections that are receiving these notices to be public facing. So the notices are applied by institutions and researchers who are stewarding those belongings and information. They're being used to clearly identify the Indigenous rights and responsibilities being present, but not what those rights and responsibilities are, which remains with the community.
So before we go into the use of these notices, we're going to take a look at the 3 main parts of the notice. So the notices have set titles and descriptions that do not change regardless of where they're used, though we do encourage additional explanations and information to accompany the notices. Still, that main text has been standardized as more of a simplified marker of Indigenous collections. Now, titles and texts are currently available for translation in our hub website into English, Te Reo Maori, Spanish, and French. And with that, I'll pass it over to Anne to share about a few uses of the notices.
Yeah, happy to. So this first example is from a peer-reviewed journal article titled Arthropods Are Kin, Operationalizing Indigenous Data Sovereignty to Respectfully Utilize Genomic Data from Indigenous Lands. And this publication was published in July 2023 by Leke Hutchins, who is Kanaka Maoli, and myself and many other collaborators. But this was a super interesting metabarcoding study of Hawaiian arthropods. Leke conducted a lot of community engagement with both native and non-native Hawaiian farmers prior to conducting the study, and recontacted them to communicate the results of the study upon its conclusion. We wanted to ensure that when we were releasing this paper and the data underlying it, that we were respecting Indigenous data sovereignty. So one of the strategies we used to do this was through using local context, labels, and notices. We decided to include the notices instead of the labels to signify that the arthropod genomic data in question were collected from Indigenous Hawaiian lands. In this case, the notice was the most appropriate, as at the time of publication, there was no centralized governance entity that could act as the authority to issue a label. Although Leke is now working to formulate a centralized arthropod native Hawaiian working group to act as that centralized entity to hopefully in future studies to be able to issue labels. So the next example, if we can, yeah, perfect, Here is a BC notice that was used on the genome sequence of the bilberry, which is a shrub that has been a significant source of nutrition for the Sami people. The Sami peoples are the indigenous peoples of Northern Europe, so both Sweden, Finland, and Norway. The samples used to assemble the genome were actually collected on Sami lands. So the international team of researchers that created this the bilberry genome assembly placed a BC notice on the genome, and it is now hosted in the genome database for the Vicinium, so the GDV database. And this BC notice is really to acknowledge the Indigenous provenance and rights associated with the bilberry and the research conducted on that genome assembly. And the next slide, yep, the researchers who placed the notice on the publication in Molecular Ecology Resources, they did place this notice on the publication from in Molecular Ecology Resources, and the notice icon was included in one of the publication figures, and the text included in the data availability statement. So you'll see kind of text included in the data availability statement, and I've seen other papers that actually include, we'll talk later about how the local context notice and labels gives you a permanent unique identifier for each label and notice that you generate. And I have seen many cases where publications are now starting to put that permanent unique identifier in the data availability statement as well, and that helps with us tracking the use of these sequences in publications as well. So I'll pass it over to Emily.
Great, yeah, so we've talked about notices so far, and now we're going to transition into a short description of our labels. Local context labels support Indigenous communities to reinsert their cultural authority and their sovereignty into spaces. Communities can use these labels to clearly state the provenance, protocols, and permissions of materials, and they're a way to keep Indigenous rights and interests with collections and data as they might move through different environments, especially digital environments.
So the labels are assigned by communities in ways that are consistent with existing community rules, governance, and protocols. The goal of the labels is to support that basic acknowledgement and attribution that, as we've talked about, is often missing, but they also move towards supporting Indigenous authorship, access, authority, and sovereignty, as well as institutional accountability. So like the notices, the labels were designed to be flexible, and so a label could be applied to a website or a database, or more specifically on a single item of cultural heritage or a data set. When they're added to materials, they become a visible indicator to anyone who accesses that material to understand its ongoing significance to the community where it comes from. They're educational, extra legal markers, and they're not tied to who, quote unquote, owns the materials. So by extra legal, we mean the labels are not legally binding or enforceable by law. And as I mentioned earlier, Indigenous people largely are not the quote unquote owners of their own materials. So the labels were created to also not be tied to who owns the material. There are 20 traditional knowledge or TK labels, which are for use on cultural heritage materials such as art and cultural belongings, library materials, which could be a publication, but also archives, photographs or videos of or about Indigenous people. The TK labels identify cultural material that has those community-specific conditions regarding access and use. The 10 biocultural or BC labels were developed to support community expectations for biocultural collections and data. They're really meant to support Indigenous people's right to decide how collections and data that come from their homelands and waters and territories are used. And if you notice, we have 3 categories for our labels as well. And so just to talk a little bit about those, we have provenance labels, and these are related to where something comes from or who might have responsibility. So this could include attribution of nations, clans, or families in relation to materials. Our protocol labels are related to protocols that determine how materials should be accessed and by whom. This could be ceremonial or sacred materials or materials with gender restrictions. There are also protocol labels that reflect if something has been verified or not, or if consent conditions are in place. And the permission labels are related to how materials should be used into the future as determined by the community. This may include if a community is open to potential commercialization, if the material was designed for educational purposes, and if the material can be used for research. So we'll take a look at one label from each of these three categories to show you this more in depth.
Yeah, so we won't actually have time to go through each of the labels today, but if you are interested in learning more about their specificities, we do encourage you to read through them on our website as you are interested. So first at the top, we have an example of a provenance label, and this is our TK Multiple Communities label. So a community uses this label if there are multiple communities that have responsibilities of custodianship or stewardship or ownership over a specific material, a piece of data, or a data set. So for example, the 4 Wabanaki nations in Maine here in the United States have customized this label so that they can use it, for instance, if there were a research project that was taking place across multiple nations' homelands. So beneath that, we have an example of a protocol label, and this one is our TK Seasonal. So this label is all about connecting knowledge and land, and a community might use this label if there are seasonal associations with material or data. So for instance, if certain songs or stories are only meant to be told or shared at a particular time of year. Now, if that were the case, this label could be used to help make that clear. Finally, we have an example of one of our permission labels, and this one is our BC non-commercial. So a community uses this label if they would like the material or data to only be used for non-commercial purposes. With this last label, there is both a TK and BC version, and there's also a TK and BC open to commercialization label. So we wanted to make both options possible depending on whether the community is interested in potential commercialization or not. And we have seen the use of the BC open to commercialization label by the Maori iwi Whakatohia on biodiversity samples that were collected from their homelands, which will actually be one of our upcoming examples. So here we're going to review the parts of a label as well as label customization. Each of the labels does come with template text, but to further support community sovereignty, communities do have the option to customize their labels. Here we're looking at the TK attribution label, which is about naming and putting proper attribution back into records. So we'll review the 3 main parts of the label now. We have the icon on the left, which does not change and is not editable. And we've decided to keep that iconography consistent because our labels are used all around the world, and standardization can be helpful for that kind of recognition. Next, we have the title, and here it's TK attribution. So this is the standard title name, which can be used in addition to the community's name for the label. And we'll often see communities translating the title into their own language. Now, lastly, we have the description here, which on the slide is going to be our template text. So communities can use this template text as it is. They can edit it to insert their name where appropriate. And then they can also write their own version of this description. So the community has that right and that power to decide what they might want to include in a label's description, which is an expression of sovereignty that helps add specificity as well as local conditions and meanings around the idea of the label.
So we're going to talk about a couple examples, but we have a super short clip from one of our short films to introduce one of these examples. So I'm going to play that next.
So there's quite a bit that actually happens under the hood to support how we deliver information out for use. Aggregation and putting it into that global framework is an important part of that. Are the fields and the standards appropriate? That means it won't get lost. And how do the aggregators of that data actually handle and make sure that stays with it?
We know most digital sequence information that sits on these databases around the globe doesn't even have the country of origin, let alone the Indigenous community connected to it. And so us making sure that the biocultural notice is in place, a biocultural label is in place, means that we stay in the mix.
The labels provide an ethical framework for us to express our rights and interests in Indigenous data without needing a comprehensive legal framework, which may never come.
The labels are critical as a tool as we start that journey, just to raise the awareness amongst the scientists, but also as a signal to the iwi and hapu that we want to collaborate with them in terms of going forward. How do we actually do this well so that there's this mutual trust and understanding?
So we would love for you to watch the full film if that's of interest to you. It is available on our YouTube, so maybe we can easily add a link. But the film really talks about multiple uses of labels, including the one that we're going to talk about here. But it's a really fantastic short film. So this is an instance of labels being applied by communities on materials circulating outside of their community. So Manaki Whenua, or Landcare Research, is a Crown research institution in Aotearoa, New Zealand. They have a biological collection of national significance and at a very large scale, represented by over 670,000 digitized specimen records, which are available in their online database. And they have applied a BC notice to every single one of those records. Most of their samples are also geolocated, and so they're able to identify the 1,400 or so specimens collected from, for example, the rohe or lands of Te Whakatauhia, which is again an iwi, a Māori iwi, and the Whakatauhia ended up applying two labels, BC Research and BC Open Commercialization. So Te Whakatauhia decided to apply those two labels across all the specimens collected from their lands. So with these labels, they're indicating that they give permission for these biocultural materials and data to be used for research purposes, and that they're open to commercialization opportunities and assert their rights to participate in discussions of both research and commercialization. So over to Emily to talk about another example.
Yeah, sure. So here's one more example of labels in use before we take a little bit of a break and a pause for questions. So we're looking at an online record for an eDNA sample that's being hosted by Weldo Lab, which is based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And these samples were collected from the homelands of Te Rorora, which is an iwi or tribe in New Zealand. And so working with the researchers, Te Rorora was able to add a BC provenance label to this website, which you can see on the right there. And by adding this label, Te Rorora are making this connection to their lands and their ongoing relationship to collections and data, which is collected from their lands. So with that last example of notices in use, we wanted to pause for questions and see if anyone had questions or comments to share.
Yeah, and we wanted to, if nobody did have questions, we wanted to suggest just a couple minutes break for everybody to stretch out, do a bio break, get some water, whatever you might need. So we wanted to suggest that at this point, if there weren't any questions, which we would be happy to answer. Cool, so maybe we'll be back by 10 of 4 minutes from now.
Oh, Corey, I just saw
Yeah.
Lynn posted a question in the
Oh,
chat.
fantastic. If a researcher wants to do ethical research or that there is a restriction on the use of the data, what should they do? Remove the data from their analysis? Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, Anne, if you want to talk about your perspective from like as a researcher, and we can certainly jump in with our perspective as well.
Yeah, so really good question. So if there is a restriction on the use of the data, what should you do? So if there was a label saying that there's some sort of restriction, I think the labels and the notices are really wonderful tool because it provides a means to have a dialogue with the community. You have a link to the actual community whose resource that is. So obviously, this gives you an opportunity to engage with the community, potentially discuss your research, and then get an answer as to whether are you interested in this research? Yay or nay? And doing things ethically and responsibly, and no response is a great response. That's good. But it also might potentially lead to a yes response where you've done the right thing. You might be establishing trust, and there's potential to actually work with the community in the future. So ultimately, I think the labels and the notices just provide this wonderful way to provide transparency and this opportunity for dialogues that could have never happened in the past to actually happen.
Yeah, and that's a really great perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that. I would say also that we do sometimes kind of hear this fear that maybe once this kind of opportunity for Indigenous communities to label their own collections and data, that it might go very restrictive. So we really look to the fair and care principles about data in terms of supporting Indigenous communities' right to decide how collections and data should be used. But I would say very generally, we have not seen that kind of very restrictive action. And to Anne's point, it's very much about opening a dialogue and being involved in those conversations.
I see another question in the chat. I'm just reading it.
Yeah, I'll read it out loud. What about data ownership for local communities not recognized internationally as quote unquote indigenous? Local farmers often keep biodiversity for centuries, and it happens that these resources are exploited and commercialized somewhere else. Yeah, so I can start this off, and I'd welcome other folks to jump in as well. But we, for our part as local contexts, we recognize that there is a difference between local communities and Indigenous peoples, but we also do allow local communities to use the labels because of this very connection. So that is kind of a part of our community definition, is to make that open, because we know that the history of colonialism and imperialism, as well as politics, has made it difficult or just a challenge for some people to identify as Indigenous, or they maybe don't have as much as a long history as Indigenous people do. So we do have that kind of more open definition exactly for that point. But I don't know if anybody else would like to add anything there.
No, I think you've done a great job.
Fabulous. Great questions. Awesome. Unless there's anything else, why don't we take a quick break? Let's do 5 of, so 55, 5 minutes from now, and then we'll get into a hub overview, talk about metadata. It's going to be a great time, so we'll be back in just a couple minutes. Use that up as a tease.
I love Damon's screen. Is it a
Me
ghost?
too. It's great.
It's
Seasonal.
supposed to be a ghost.
I love it.
We can see that he's been doing that for a whole month and that he's really ready.
It's the most wonderful time of the year.
I'll use the break to mention that. So I'm at CUP Biodiversity in Cali, and I attended a meeting yesterday, and someone mentioned local context, and that was super cool. So I'll send more info to you. I think you know that person, but I just took a
Katie
picture of
Lee.
it. I'll send it over. Yes.
Was it? Yeah, yeah. Kaylee's fantastic. That's so great to hear. Yeah, I would love to hear more about that.
Sure.
Awesome. Awesome. So we're gonna switch into the hub demo next. So I'm gonna share a different part of my screen and hopefully it's gonna work. So give me a little patience here. Okay, great. All right, it did pretty good. Awesome. Great. So we are going to look at the local context hub, and we're going to be using the Sandbox Hub for today. This very closely mirrors the live site. You might see some new features here before they're public. This is a great place if you are interested in local context and want to try out how this would actually work, maybe figure out an API connection, work out some workflows. So the Sandbox site is open to anyone to use. And also just a note that our Sandbox Hub was updated just last week. So we might see some bugs or issues today or new things that we get to work on. So I'll sign in and get into the hub. I'll pass over to you, Emily, just to talk a little bit about what is the hub?
Yeah. So the main purpose of the hub is to facilitate that application of labels and notices. Now, on the hub, Indigenous communities can customize and apply their traditional knowledge or biocultural labels, and they can apply those labels either to their own materials or to materials that might be stewarded elsewhere. Institutions and researchers who are working with Indigenous collections and data have the opportunity to generate and apply notices and also to notify communities about any relevant collections and data that they might be holding. Now, just a little bit of a note before we go into the account types. The hub is not a data repository, so it's meant to refer to data and materials that are held outside of the hub. So those data and materials might be in your own databases, collections management software, or even a website. So we're going to start with a couple of different main account types here. So we have community, institution, researcher, and then soon to be coming is our service provider account. I'll start with community. So that will be the only account that can customize and apply the labels. And this account is for Indigenous or local communities. And those might be represented by a cultural center or a TIPO or a land department within an iwi or tribe. Beneath that, we have our institution and researcher accounts, and those two accounts will be applying notices. So through collaboration, they can also get access to labels that would be applied by communities to their projects. A little bit of a difference between those two accounts. Institution accounts do differ from researcher accounts in that there can be multiple people within them, while the researcher account is primarily for individuals who are conducting research, gathering data, or publishing, and then they can apply notices on that data or material themselves. Institution account is really meant for organizations, so that could be a university or it could be a library within a university. Now, lastly, we have our service provider account, and this will be a new account type that's going to be rolling out with some of our hub updates in January. So service providers are companies that offer platforms like databases and collections management systems that will not use the notices or labels themselves, but who have instead built a connection to the hub into their own platforms so that their customers can more easily apply notices and labels. So now we're coming back to our home page. And as you can see, this is sort of our home or profile page. As an individual user, I can be a member of multiple accounts and multiple account types. So as you see here with Corey strolling through, she has a researcher account, and she's also a member of a couple of community accounts here, as well as a selection of institution accounts. So I think with
Thanks,
that, we're going to
Emily.
start walking through how to create a project.
Yeah, perfect. So we did create an institution account in case there is anybody who's interested to join this account. You would be welcome to. We are going to use it so you can see this live on the Sandbox Hub in case you are interested. So there's a couple different parts to an account here, but we're going to focus on projects for today. So I'm going to go into creating a project here. And so a project is meant to describe what a notice or a label is being applied to. So as we've talked about, labels and notices are flexible, and so projects are also flexible. They can be describing a single cultural heritage item or a single data set. They could also be describing a whole collection, multiple data sets, metadata about a record, website, syllabus, publications, and more. So the project we're creating is really meant to describe what the notice is being applied to or the label. So this project form that we're going to go through is asking for a summary of information, who should be contacted, some additional information, and then also visibility. So we're going to walk through this today. It takes a couple minutes and we'll use an actual real life example that we talked about earlier, just so you can kind of see what type of information is needed. So we are going to refer to the bilberry genome that we talked about a little bit earlier. Just as an example, I've just pulled up the actual GDV, the entry for the genome. You can see it already does have a VC notice, but we're going to create it as though that's not yet there. So the first thing that we would do when we're creating our project is to select which notices we'd like to apply. So in this case, we are going to use a BC biocultural notice, but you can select multiple notices or just one if you'd like. You can also see we do have the option to select multiple translations. So as Emily mentioned, we do have 4 languages currently available: English, French, Spanish, and Mandarin. So we'll include a French one just to show. Actually, we'll include Spanish just to show you what that actually looks like on the project page. And so the next step that we'll do here is to enter some basic project information. So this is information about what it is we are applying the notice to. So again, thinking about this bilberry genome data, we have an option to select here what our project type is. So the options that we have here are item, collection, samples, expedition, publication, exhibition, and other. I think the best fit for this would be samples, but if we weren't pleased with that, we could select other and type in another project type, such as a film or database. So I'll select samples for this. Next, we'll give this a brief title. So I'm going to copy over the scientific name here as our project title. Next, we'll enter a brief project description. It does not need to be all the information that you know about this project, especially if you are going to be adding a link. But if we go back here, there's not too much descriptive information here. But I think we'll just copy that same kind of title information. Maybe the date would be good to include here. I'm not too sure what other information the folks who would be using this research would be interested in, but we'll copy over the date and we'll, just for demonstration purposes, use the title again here. So the project link, I can just grab that URL and add that. We can add multiple project links if that is applicable. And that's really all the kind of basic information about the project. The next couple of steps here are about like who should be contacted and other optional information. So we'll go to that next. So this section, project contacts, is who's involved in the project, who should be contacted if somebody's interested. So this might be the person creating the project. It might be somebody else. I will enter myself for today. For project contributors, we have the option to select people on the hub. This is, again, the Sandbox hub, so we can select here. I'll select Ashley as an example, just to show you what that looks like. We could also add people by name and email, so they would be notified about the project as well. Next section here is all optional. This is optional project information. So there are a couple fields here, providers project ID. So this could be any kind of format. If we go back here and see if maybe this is some sort of number that is helpful, we can add that and it will keep kind of all this metadata together. We also have the option to add a GUID or a DOI, which are also permanent identifier forms that might be attached to a data set or a collection or a publication. After that, we have another optional section. This is project boundary. So this is a new section for us. It's kind of our first iteration of mapping on the local context hub in this effort to connect communities with their collections and data. So there's currently two options for this. You can search the native land digital database, or you can upload a shapefile. So let's see if Sammy pops up. I don't think they do. So just as an example to show you what this looks like. So we can search the native land digital database and see, for instance, Lenape hooking as a boundary. So we'll clear that just for example. The second option is to upload a shapefile, which would look very similar to what we just looked at, something to map out the project. Sorry, cold season. So the last section here is about project visibility. So who should be able to see the project? So we have three options: public, contributor view, and private, but we'll leave it on public for today. And so this project that now exists here has all the information that we added. We do have the option to notify communities about the project. And we see the notice that we attached here. So after the project has been created, we're going to kind of go into what happens next. Ashley's going to walk us through how the project information might show up in the metadata, and then we'll come back to those great questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So let me switch over to the slides and we'll get into that.
Thanks. Awesome. So thank you guys so much for going through the hub with that. Just as a visual representation of the workflow we just saw of creating an account, well, not creating an account, but seeing the different account types, creating a project with a notice as an institution. The researcher creating a project with a notice workflow works the same way. And then after a project is created, it can be, a community can be notified of that project so that they have the ability to apply labels to that project. So when creating the project on the hub, it would be, when it comes to the description and all of the metadata that's included, it's really describing what the community would be applying their labels to. So as much information as is useful is usually what we suggest when creating a project. But once a local context project is created, then what's next? Well, if we look at what was included in the project information, we have the title of the project, the date it was created and by whom, a description, the different identifiers, and so on. And this, as we had spoken about throughout the presentation, is also what's known as metadata. And so this metadata, or data about data, in the project's scope is what's sent between different systems to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, or what's also known as the FAIR principles. So this is really the basis around open data. This metadata is standard across many platforms, typically as the bare minimum that's needed to describe anything. So think of when you create files on your computer or add anything to Google Drive or anything similar, you are always at least asked for the title of the file, and the system will automatically save you as the author, the date it was created, the file type, and so on. But aside from this, if you can go, yeah, what's missing? You know, we saw in the project creation, and of course, the whole point of the Local Context Hub is to facilitate the application of labels and notices. So then where do these fit within other systems, such as databases or websites where Indigenous voices have not previously had a space? So if we look at the project from earlier, we can see there's notice metadata, and then we also have another project showing labels as well, which we can see all the parts of the notice and labels as described earlier in the presentation. So the majority of the examples that we've shown already represent the human readable edition of labels and notices, such as the example with Manaki Whenua's website, right? We can see the labels or notices applied to this item on the website in this format. But how does the database that holds that specimen data or any other database store the label or notice metadata within the system? One option is to use already existing fields that are standard across all databases, similar to the title or author creator fields that we showed previously. The most common field that the labels or notices have been added to across system has been the rights fields, similar to what we had heard previously in terms of copyrights and so on. The example shown here is from the Darwin Tree of Life manifest with the rights field of regulatory compliance. So rights fields within metadata define the set of rights, including access, copyrights for a specific digital object. Rights fields tend to be a standard across many different systems, though may not always be the best fit for the labels or notices, which deal with Indigenous rights, but are extra legal or not legally binding or enforceable by law. Because of this, some individuals, when they have started implementing the labels or notices into their systems, have opted to using their own custom created field to add labels or notices to if they're able to do that. So the example here is from the Urga manifest with multiple custom fields aimed towards the local context labels and project information. So it includes a space for the project ID number, which is generated when the project is created. And that's a way to link the two systems together. While specific, this option poses a bit of an issue in case the label or notice information is not able to stay associated with the data of that item. So for example, was trying to think of an example that everyone has encountered at least at one point Let's say you typed up a resume with all general information needed, name, job history, education, etc. But you also added an extra section for conferences or presentations or anything similar to that. When it comes time to upload that resume to a job application or copy over the information from your resume to the application, odds are that a majority of those application systems don't have a space for presentations or conferences or anything like that. So that information gets dropped off or just stays part of your resume, and you have to hope that someone can manually go in and see it on your resume. So just like that, these custom fields for the labels or notices, if they're not already added to existing fields that can translate across multiple systems, they may end up getting dropped off, which means that they may not end up keeping the Indigenous voices with the data once it moves somewhere else. So until a space for Indigenous voices is standardized within metadata spaces, another solution would be to utilize already existing fields that specify how some can be used. So for this example here, it's from a plugin that was created that uses MARC metadata structure. Instead of solely relying on that structure's equivalent of a rights field, just general field, the developer that created this plugin mapped each of the notice and labels to fields that more closely represented the intent of the notices or labels. So by utilizing subfields and specific codes within that structure, the codes themselves, when read by a machine, knows what it should be indicating, what should be doing. And so by allowing that, it adds more of that intent that the indigenous voices are utilizing with the labels. So by allowing for that space, the labels and notices within metadata gives greater control over the application and use of Indigenous data and Indigenous knowledge for a collective benefit.
So much, Ashley. So we'd love to take some questions. I'll come back to those questions we didn't get to yet. We just want to show this how to stay connected and get involved. Emily's going to drop a couple of these links right into the chat in case you're interested. We have a lot of information on our website, localcontext.org, including many of the examples we looked at today. We have a support email. We are on social media. We have a newsletter, and we also have a bunch of online networks and working groups that we would love to have you join. The technical implementation working group might be a really good fit for you, might be of interest. So we would love to have you consider joining those as well. We also just like to end on this beautiful artwork by our council chair, James Eric Francis Sr., who is Penobscot. Just a really nice way to end us. So I'll come back to that first question that I saw in the chat that we didn't get to yet. Could you talk about the resources needed to apply a notice, time, money, etc.? We often hear in research, I don't have the resources to engagement. Even though this work does not replace engagement, could you talk about the complexity of the mechanism? Which is a really great question, one that we hear from many perspectives. So it definitely is a range. I would say from my perspective, and I'd love others on the team to jump in as well. There's kind of a couple considerations for actually applying a notice. From an institutional or researcher perspective, there's kind of a technical aspect of how much work needs to be done to allow this to be added. It could be simple, it could be a little bit more complex, and that would be true for labels as well. For actually engaging with Indigenous communities, I would say there is certainly a time aspect involved from both sides to that. And there's sometimes a money aspect as well, financial compensation. I think it definitely depends on your existing relationship. If it is a new one, it's going to take more time. But if it is an existing relationship, it really could be done from the kind of technical aspect of using the hub. It can be done pretty quickly, but there's often a lot of time and consideration that does go into selecting and applying labels. I don't know if anyone else from the team wants to add anything there, Anne, as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quickly. In terms of those resources that you were asking about, and potentially helping educate maybe potential community partners who you might want to engage with this work in, we do offer downloadable resources, which are up on our website, and that can sort of help in terms of give overviews about what local context is. The community can then decide whether or not they're interested in doing this kind of work. And then in addition, to Corey's point about how sometimes the technical aspect can be a little bit difficult, we do have some guides to help sort of walk through potential processes as well. So just a couple of other factors that I think we try to lessen the load for institutions and researchers as well as communities who are engaging in this work.
Yeah, and I guess from my implementation of the labels perspective, from both researchers and institutions through the European Reference Genome Atlas, what I found, uh, it's very diverse, the amount of time and resources that one would need to implement them. But what I found really beneficial was that for the European Reference Genome Atlas, we built in the labels from the start. So we did not have to retrofit this mechanism into a currently established mechanism, which made everything so much easier. So actually implementing the labels from the start made the time and resources technically needed to do it a lot smaller. So knowing that you're going to implement the labels at the start is really, really beneficial for that. But I know some museum collections, for instance, they have kind of archaic systems. I don't mean archaic, but very old systems that they've been using for a long time. And perhaps implementing the labels and notices in those spaces might be more difficult to do because they're trying to operate or retrofit the labels into a pre-existing system. So it really, I think, from my perspective anyway, just depends on a case by case basis how quickly that can be done. It also helps just from like if you're thinking about implementing the labels to join the technical implementation working group, because you can get these wonderful examples of projects that are extremely similar to yours that have gone through the process of already implementing them, and they can show you the steps that they took to implement them. And people are very willing to share their experiences. They might be using the same metadata standards to you. They might be using similar systems to you. So there's kind of resources in multiple ways through the website and through the working groups to really help people embed the labels within systems.
Yeah, and just a final kind of addition to that as well. If when it comes to the relationships with communities, of course, like Corey said, if those aren't already established, that may be the one thing that kind of takes the longest to develop, and then, the application of the labels. But we also always suggest if you're able to, as a researcher or institution, get started with the notices just to indicate that there is Indigenous knowledge associated with that item, collection, data, whatever the case might be. That's always a good first step, and it's often easier and quicker to be able to apply a notice to something. And still having that indication there is something more than we've had previously when it comes to Indigenous voices or Indigenous data markers. And so having that as a start while you work on those relationships or while you kind of, implement in other areas is always a good first step.
Thanks, everyone. Other questions or thoughts or anything? Thanks for those great questions.
So the EBP as a whole, how are you guys being able to advise the EBP in any way? Because surely this is partly what the EBP is about, right? So this would be hugely important for that kind of work. So yeah.
Yeah, so the Earthify Genome Project, that's kind of the umbrella for Ashley and Corey. That's kind of the umbrella for the European Reference Genome Atlas, where the kind of European node to that. We have been trying to bring the local context, and the EBP are very supportive of the inclusion of the labels into their standards. So Maui Hudson, who's actually one of the founders of Local Context, is on the Ethics, Legal and Social Issues Committee for the EBP. And so we're just trying to connect the pieces with I guess the first EBP metadata standard is a couple of years old and it's now being revamped. So hopefully in these newer versions, it will be a kind of standard of practice to have the labels and notices integrated into them. But also it's coming from an even higher level at this point because, you know, Celine, who's on the call today, is attending the Conference of Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity, and integration of they're calling it indigenous metadata or biodiversity metadata into associating that with digital sequence information is what they call genomics data is now becoming mandatory. Well, it's integrated into the text of these treaties. So they may not be specifically calling out local context because they don't want to be advocating for a specific organization, but the local context is probably the most developed way to efficiently label your metadata. So it's kind of going to be at an even higher level eventually that this will become a mandatory obligation. So it's wonderful when we have these tools and infrastructures and, you know, these educational resources that people can look to, hopefully through this channel, of how they can be implemented when that time does come when they're actually mandatory.
Okay, cool.
I think that ties in really nicely with the other question here in the chat about the labels and notices in databases like ENA and NCBI. So exactly to Anne's point, like there's definitely a lot of conversation around how to include Indigenous metadata. We have been in conversation with folks like NCBI as well as GBIF about including local contexts in their databases. So it's somewhat a little bit of an ongoing conversation. I would say very generally that the more folks who are asking for local context or talking about local context, sometimes these databases do want to see like a real life example. They want to see interest. And so that can really prompt them to consider adding in that connection. But I don't know if anybody else on the team or Anne, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah. So last year, the INSDC, who's kind of the umbrella for ENA, DDBGA, and NCBI, did call for a meeting to discuss about how they can better include Indigenous rights and interests into their database. And again, this was really instilled by the push from the Convention on Biological Diversity to really start thinking through how to do this. So during that discussion, they were we kind of outlined the labels and notices, and they were very interested in how to implement them. And, you know, I think a super cool thing about the local context labels and notices in a way that makes them very attractive for the INSDC, because the INSDC is open and unrestricted, is the labels and notices are extra legal. They don't impose any legal obligations that then the INSDC would have to implement or monitor in some sort of way, because the INSDC really don't have the capacity to track and trace usage of the data within their systems right now. So they did actually find it a very attractive way. It's just trying to figure out the best way to integrate them into their systems. And I think this came up a lot because when we were really thinking about pushing this through the European Reference Genome Atlas, we wanted to make sure that we were pushing them into the right fields in a consistent way into the INSDC, so that when we were kind of aggregating data, somebody might want to aggregate all of the data that have local context notices on them. Incredibly hard to do if they're all sitting in different fields in the database. Very lot easier to do if they're in a consistent field, and that can be easily collected. So trying to get that interoperability amongst the community, as well as finding a consensus for where's the best home for something like a permanent unique identifier for a biocultural label is super important. So that work's kind of all going on behind the scenes. So hopefully we'll see the fruits soon.
Yeah, and I will add to that as well. I mean, that's where looking at the different metadata field options is so important, because, there's those, like I had mentioned before, there's the rights field, there's custom fields, and then there's like fields that are already available that we can make sure that the labels are there. However, it also, as Anne just said, spreads them out in ways where it will make it difficult as well to see where the information is for the labels or notices. And so there's so much work that's going on with this. There's been discussions on if and how we can include Indigenous metadata bundle to have the space within these databases, so that we don't have to worry about like a custom field getting dropped off in multiple systems. And then on the specifying field side, I've been doing some work with schema.org with our JSON linked data, mapping each of the labels or notices into specific fields that allow for machine readability and interoperability. And with that, once those are published, there have already been discussions of GBIF looking to utilize the schema.org mappings within their system as well. So GBIF, I believe, uses Darwin Core. And so we were, once those schema mappings are published, having like a crosswalk between schema mappings and the Darwin Core mappings that GBIF uses, so that they can work in tandem with each other and become a bit of kind of template for different structures to have a space for the labels and notices within those already built-in fields. So there's like all these different kind of moving parts, and when it comes to having the labels and notices travel with the data. But yeah, that so far that's been what's been happening.
So just to follow up on that, Ashley, so the intention is to map the schema.org Indigenous metadata bundle onto the Darwin Core mapping. That's cool, because that EBP's metadata standard is Darwin Core, so that makes life a lot easier.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, it's a step in that direction of being able to have it a bit more specific in terms of what the labels are really indicating for the data itself. And hopefully we just get to that point where we can have the space for the labels and notices in their own right, to be able to travel within different systems. But this is kind of like a intermediate step, if anything.
There's just another question in the chat. So that, yeah, if a project already includes these fields in their project, it will be easier for them in the future. Yes, absolutely. How can we help spread the word among scientists and spark their interest for such fields already? Does anybody want to take that one?
one thing that I can think of at the moment, that's kind of not in terms of sparking interest, but a lot of organizations, governments are now also requiring Indigenous knowledge to be identified. And so in light of that requirement, it has now also encouraged people to seek tools that allow for Indigenous voices to be added to these items. And so we've seen kind of a jump in that direction, leading to the labels and notices, because there previously hasn't been anything that allows for that to be added into different structure systems. So with, I believe it was the beginning of this year, earlier this year, where there were quite a few regulatory changes to require Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous say for items, especially I know with museums was a big thing, and so on. And that got a lot of people to being like, okay, what can we use to be able to add their voices? You know, and the labels are already there, and the hub is already that tool to help facilitate that communication between between institutions and researchers and Indigenous communities. So aside from the requirements, I would just say, you know, guiding them to, we have tons of resources on our websites. Corey, I don't know if you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think just as you're kind of talking about things that we do have on our website, I think the films are a really great introduction and really get at the heart of what local context is trying to do in the community's own words. Local context is really about ethics, so a kind of appeal to ethics might be something to consider, but I think the films are a really great kind of powerful, emotional introduction to some of these issues, in addition to what Ashley just mentioned.
And I think there is this kind of recognition. I think that researchers are becoming more acquainted with the FAIR principles, what it means to make their data fair. But as well as that, a lot of researchers are also now aware of what the CARE principles stand for. And they are, in my experience, many people are looking for ways to implement the CARE principles. You know, what does that mean? How can I technically do that? And the labels provide this wonderful way to start thinking through how to hold yourself accountable to the CARE principles and by implementing the labels, which is nice. So I think there's kind of that coming from the research. Also kind of you know, when things start to happen in NCB for biodiversity genomics researchers, when things start to happen at the level of the INSDC, it makes researchers makes it a lot easier to implement the labels. So it's kind of the researchers that need to have a push and have the knowledge of using the labels, but it's also that at a kind of broader level, there needs to be infrastructure there for them to be able to easily slot into. So it's not this huge lift for them. So trying to make it easier for researchers to do that.
So it's already been alluded to that museums have pushed back on this sort of thing. I can only imagine how much British museums specifically have pushed back on it. What's the kind of pushback been from businesses? Because I can imagine, like, corn is probably the most famously abused crop in just ever. Yeah, what's the pushback been?
I would say, from my experience, I think the helpful kind of message that I'll share is there are a lot of museums and institutions in the UK and Europe who are now having an interest in at least identifying this information. In some countries, it's becoming mandated as part of their kind of reckoning with their colonial legacy. So that's been great to see that interest. I think from companies, it's been a little bit of a mixed bag. We haven't had too much interaction at local contexts, but I would say since local context is very much an opt-in, we have seen some folks who are interested in this work. And so we'll see businesses that are especially focused on Indigenous foodways, for instance, have an interest in local context to be a part of their kind of protection of Indigenous interests. But I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything.
The only thing I can think of, which doesn't point directly to businesses themselves, but more kind of from the beginning. One thing with the Menaki Whenua example, where the labels were applied to those specimens from Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the community Whakatauhia, they were able to apply their labels at the start, where it's before it gets to like the genome sequencing of certain things, because I know it's talked about in the film as well, that they utilize, they have businesses that tie to the oysters, I believe it was, that are within the coastline.
Mussels.
Mussels, there we go. And by having the labels set at the very beginning before any bioinformation is kind of expanded into commercialization options, it gives the community that basis of, well, if there is commercial opportunities, that they need to be consulted with that, because that is their Indigenous knowledge, is from their lands. And so that's been more, I think, of where we've seen the use of the labels and whatnot is at the kind of start before it expands outward. Just because once it's already out, it's out, and it's sometimes very hard to identify what has been kind of disseminated from Indigenous lands or knowledge. So by starting at the very beginning before it gets to that point has been kind of the target option for at least the communities in New Zealand that we've seen so far, at least.
That's cool. Thank you very much.
Any other questions or thoughts from anyone? We really appreciate all these really great engaged questions.
Well, it's been a very cool talk. There's a lot to read upon and watch upon after this, so thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your organization and support. And thanks everybody who was able to tune in or watch the recording.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank
And if
you.
there's nothing else, see you all in the next one.